As the storm of the COVID-19 pandemic subsided and international borders restrictions relaxed, I took the opportunity to visit Italy on my way to the EFTA 22 conference in Ljubljana. I was fascinated to trace the influence of the original Milan Fall. The following is my first in-person conversation, which I held with Matteo Selvini in Milan, Italy. Matteo kindly welcomed me into his training school and into his home, the place where he was born and raised. Matteo Selvini is a psychologist and family psychotherapist, director of the Mara Selvini Palazzoli Scuola di Psicoterapia, located in Milan. He's interested in working with challenging adolescents, in particularly with post-traumatic personality disorders and in the area of family secrets. He is the son of highly respected and world-renowned Mara Selvini Palazzoli, co-founder of the Milan Approach, along with Luigi Boscolo, Gianfranco Cecchin, and Juliana Pratt. Matteo, in addition to sharing a mother-child bond, also shared a colleague bond with Mara, as she later regrouped with Matteo, Stefano Cirillo, and Anna Maria Sorrentino. My conversation with Matteo touches on the origins of the Milan Approach, while it centers around Mara's inspirational influence and the approach, as well as her involvement in the creation of the Mara Selvini Palazzoli School of Psychotherapy. Matteo shares some professional and personal stories about Mara, discusses her respected work and legacy. He also shares his own influence in approach through his school, where the amalgam of the original and emerging concepts are met.
Hello,
Hello, Daisy.
how are you, Matteo? I'm really delighted that I'm here with you in your school in Milan, in your native Milan, and I'm delighted with our, as you know, the news associate editor of the Australian New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy, and as part of that, I conduct conversations and interviews with different notable family therapists around the world, and I'm delighted that I can be here with you, and thank you for welcoming me into your space in Milan. And so I would like to have a discussion with you and a conversation about that. And I guess one of the first things I like to ask you is about the evolution of the Milan approach. And so there's many parts to this. So the evolution about the Milan approach, and how is it different from the original stage to now, and particularly with the scuola that you have. So it's the Mara Selvini Palazzoli. You can tell me, Mara Selvini Palazzoli Scuola di Psicoterapia.
Scuola di Psicoterapia. Mara Selvini Palazzoli is our school. Yes, now we have around 280 students in 4 different places in Italy and in Switzerland.
Oh wow!
So now we became a big institution in a sense.
That's amazing.
But the history basically is a very long history, and there is a documentary dedicated to my mother's life, which can explain better in detail this history. But to give a synthesis, I can say the story is a story of a young doctor. My mother at the end of the years 40s was a young doctor. He didn't think completely about psychiatry or psychotherapy or psychology. She was specializing in laboratory examinations, but working in Milan Central Hospital, she met the first anorectic girl. At the time was a completely unknown illness, because during many years of war anorexia didn't exist, because anorexia, this is historically and sociologically proved is connected to the fact of having much food available. So during the war, before the war, anorexia really didn't exist. So the fact, is a historical fact, was a young doctor meeting the first young anorectic arriving in hospital and discussing with her professor the fact that this was not a physical illness, because they wanted to starve, they wanted to be thin. And so the meeting of my mother with anorectic girls was what triggered her curiosity about why. I have, in the video you can say, she says, I was starved by curiosity to understand why this very nice girl decided to starve herself. And so she started to study psychology, psychoanalysis, psychiatry in order to understand these girls. And so in the years, also I think before, at the beginning of the 50s, when she was a young doctor, she started with individual therapy of anorectic girls. She started with very, very long therapy lasting years and years, just in the years when I was born, because I was born in 54, precisely in the apartment where we are now. My mother was, many afternoons, she was meeting anorectic girls. And her experience, her personal experience of the difficulties, the failures, the long time needed for, conducted her to the idea of meeting also with the family. So the radical shift of the she made at the beginning of the 70s was to abandon. She was very, very radical, abandoning totally at the beginning of the 70s individual therapy, to conduct in the idea that now we can judge a little omnipotent idea of treating anorectic girls with 10 sessions of family therapy. This was the revolution of the 70s, described later in the book Paradox and Counter-Paradox. And then what happened? Happened that in reality, what is very interesting from a scientific point of view, was to discover that there was an interesting percentage of cases where family session, and at the beginning she experimented family session with a more psychoanalytical approach, which was not so working so well. So she met Paul Watzler, she studied the international literature, she had many contacts in the States, and so she developed the idea of thinking family therapy not in a systemic, not in a psychoanalytic. So at the beginning of the 70s, she formed a famous group with Bosco, Cecchini, and Prata in this new systemic, very provocative and radically way. What was scientifically interesting, what was impressive for my mother, was to see that existed a percentage of anorectic girls which abandoned the symptom only after a few family sessions. And this was historically the beginning of a great enthusiasm. This was a demonstration that this possibility of working with the whole family could be a very powerful instrument. But all the history until now was to to go deep in this idea, because it's still very true that working also the big change, I think, also the big difference of our school with other schools in the systemic field, that from our point of view now we really believe a lot in integrating individual ideas with systemic ideas. And also for this, for example, in general, everybody defines our identities as a relational systemic therapist. I don't like very much this name, because I think I like the systemic idea. I think it's very important, because it's the idea that we have to find resources for change, not only in the patients but also in the family, in the important relations of the patient. The systemic idea is, so I define myself as systemic. But then I think the necessity is to integrate systemic ideas with individual ideas about how the development of the child leads to some difficult situation. And so this is the approach that we are trying now, the difference, because making a synthesis, my mother was at the beginning had a very psychoanalytic individual approach. She met the limit of this approach. She made this radical change to a systemic, only family, quick, rapid, few family session, two very extremistic approaches with many limits. And now we are trying to develop a different method where we are really doing a parallel therapy, where we alternate many times family sessions with individual sessions, for example, with anorectic girls. But not only from the point of view of setting, it's not only a matter of integrating individual and family session, but also a matter of the model, the thinking model of the therapist, where we need also individual ideas. We need in our last book I gave you before is called the 7 Doors of Systemic Therapists. So we need the systemic diagnosis, a 3-generational approach. We also need to evaluate the personality and the attachment of the patient. And this is basically our approach now. Try to integrate, also to integrate all the post-traumatic ideas. No, especially I give a great importance now to the idea of disorganization of attachment, and how the young children reorganized after a history of disorganized attachment. And this is an idea of studying the distortion or the evolution of the child, integrate this development idea of the children with the systemic idea. I think it's very important. So what we do and what we teach now is really a model that we call a systemic approach, family individual model. This is the idea of integrate individual ideas.
Yes.
We have it integrated also in our training, the MDR approach, which is basically an individualistic approach, but it's a technique we use and we find useful in many cases. So this is the situation of the moment.
Right.
Working to an integrative model, this has led us away from the more constructivist models of systemic therapy, which are too systemic from our point of view.
What do you mean by that? Too systemic?
Too systemic is the attitude of thinking too much in terms of only of system and of 3-generational ideas, and not considering the individual in itself, the relationship of the patient with himself or herself. And this For example, I had a discussion with some constructivistic expert. We said that they said we don't have to use the idea that the child can be disorganized, because this is pathologizing the child. Like, this I consider really systemic extremistic. That the risk that the target is pathologizing is not possible, that can block the possibility of thinking also in terms of individual function, individual development, individual pathology too. That exists. Here I think the too radical idea of depathologizing is too systemic and is very dangerous, because in many countries, not in Italy, because in Italy we didn't have this so put really systemic therapy outside the field of psychiatry as the main and this is a big problem. I have also I can say the political idea that this integration of individual and systemic field can help us to stay inside the field of psychotherapy and psychiatry, and don't be put aside in a very isolated, alternative, strange therapy.
So it's kind of welcoming, embracing both.
Yes.
Being able to acknowledge that there is a point, that there's a value in both approaches.
Exactly.
In order to understand better and work better
also
with these young people.
Sometimes the problem systemic therapist, I was trained in the 80s. In the reality of a young psychologist, a young psychotherapist, more than half of your time, professional time, is individual therapy. And you need instruments to you have to learn how to conduct also individual therapy. Maybe sometimes this is a fundamental part. Why it's true that we have to give an apport and help to the field of psychotherapy in the part of teaching psychoanalysts, the cognitivists, to use the resources of, for example, not having only individual session, but this kind of parallel. This is a contribute we have to give to our colleagues, but we ourselves have to learn also from other people with different experience how to conduct good individual therapy. So the risk of I think of being too systemic was the risk of not developing a good way of approaching especially individual therapy, but in general all the act of thinking about the function, thinking about the functioning of individuals, of patients, of relatives, is not pathologizing from my point of view. Is an attempt to understand. This I think was
it's about deepening understanding and be able to provide the best care and best support,
of course,
the best outcome for the person.
And we have to pay attention, of course, to not pathologizing, but to run to this risk. We cannot avoid to think about this individual side of the individual function.
So do you think then, so when the original story, and thank you for that, the information about that and the evolution, how it came to be, as you were saying, your mother so she started something new. She was, a revolutionary almost, right? Because she started as an analyst, I'm assuming. She started as a psychiatrist, an analyst. And then, as she was working with anoretic girls, particularly girls, wasn't it, like women?
Yes.
And I believe the centers as well. There were a few centers I heard that they were throughout Italy that were particularly for young women with anorexia. So she started with that was the initial stages of her career, and then she discovered, as she was working through things, with these young women, that it was important to look systemically as well.
Yes.
And that's why, hence the evolution.
Yes.
And it was 1970. I know there is a bit of a, how can I say, different ideas about whether it was 1971 or 1972 or something like that, when Mara along Cecchin and Boscolo and Prata developed the Milan approach, and that would have been around then. And
yes, it was really in the 70s. It was a very rapid process, because the model historically was developed in the first years of the 70s, and in the 75 Paradox was published in Italian. In 78 it was translated in the States, but in reality in very few years, 72, 73, 74, the model of this radical model of paradoxical therapy was developed.
Yes.
And then the road diverged, because my mother decided at the end of the 70s, it was a very rapid process in reality, because at the end of the 70s, a few years ago, Bosco Cecchin decided to teach the model around the world, started to travel all the world, and my mother decided to develop the model working with Prata, and she built a new team with her son.
Yes, with yourself.
Matteo, myself,
Matteo, yes.
Stefano Cirillo, Anna Maria Sorrentino. So,
and you still continue today.
Yes, so there is a great continuity, because we started to work with my mother in the year 82, and now my mother worked with us many years. We had many years together, from 82. In 88 we published the book Family Games. At the end, around the year 95, 96, the health of my mother started to decline, but we had time to publish a book about anorexia, anorexic girls, which was out in Italy 98. And then my mother in the 99 unfortunately died, but it's past more than 30 years that myself, Stefano Cirillo and Anna Maria Sorrentino, we are still working together. So it's publishing and
and there
so it was a long continuity, and the strength of this continuity was this idea of really integrating really systemic and individual ideas.
Yes,
basically.
Blending in that
it's
integration.
a very simple idea.
Yes. So the one that you were talking about was il giochi psicotico della famiglia.
Giochi della famiglia, feminist games in English.
In English, yes. And ragazze
anoressiche bulimiche, which was which didn't have the other historical fact that until Family Games we had, maybe through the work of my mother, a certain strong connection between the Latin world of family therapy and the Anglo-Saxon world.
Yes.
It's not the case probably that we had no translation when my mother was out of the game. Really, I think for this I am also happy to have this interview today, because we really lived from the end of the 90s a big distance with the States, because of maybe also for this theoretical way of our attitude of not agree with the constructivist way of thinking family therapy, which was prevalent in the north of the world, in the States, in the north of Europe. So really, historically, it's very strange, the situation where we have our model very strong in Latin America, in Spain, in France, in the not English speaking world. No?
Yes.
So this was a
It's quite
very
interesting,
funny
isn't it?
cultural difference.
It is a very interesting thing, isn't
Yeah.
it? The different concepts, the different interpretation,
Yes.
how you take that, and it's very much context and cultural based as
Yes.
well, where you feel the situations, the cases that you encounter, the very situations that you come across in terms of families and individuals that you work with, and the influences of the day as well in the context of politically and
Yes.
all those things, all those various elements, isn't it? So that certainly impacts very much that, isn't it? And even I would say probably with yourself, I mean, when you go and present in Colombia, there will be some elements that there's some differences in terms of
Yes.
the application, because there's always going to be different interpretations
Yes,
and
of
applications
course, okay,
depending
of
on
course, of course.
Yes, and so that makes it quite interesting, to quite enriching, I would think.
But anyway, it's very easy because in my professional life, yes, I went sometimes to the United States to some psychotherapy at the family therapy network conference, but really I lived this detachment from the English speaking world, and a strong connection with the French and Spanish and also Brazilian speaking. You know, it's very funny. This was really a cultural phenomenon. Our model, our integrative model, was very well accepted in this culture, but not in the English-speaking world. For
Quite
some
an
reason.
interesting thing. It'll be something to kind of write about as well, isn't it? And to inquire a little bit more. And I know you've written quite a bit too. So you've had publications with your mother and
Yes.
with Cirillo and
then we
so
continue to publish.
exactly. And
in
you've
our
done
team.
quite a bit as part of your team, and there are a couple of things, you know, that you've come up. And one of them was the publication with your about your mother as well. It was
Yes.
extremely heartfelt. I was in tears when I was reading it because it's about what led to her personal life, and we all as therapists, we all have a personal life.
Yes, of
You know, the
course.
person of the therapist, the self of the therapist, however you want to call it, but we are a person first. And so there'll be, you know, our own influences, our own historical context, our culture will influence what path we take. And I guess as part of your mother in this particular publication is that it was the impetus, her very experience and story about hurt and about pain and about trauma.
And this is really the basic idea of the documentary I told you before,
Yes.
because the documentary is based on the fil rouge of the documentary is the connection between therapeutic choices of my mother and her personal life.
Yes.
The basic content is the content of the conference I gave. Yes, it was the paper Matteo Selvini Palazzoli, History of Resilience.
That's
I
right.
wrote this paper in the year of my mother's death, 99, because Maurizio Andolfi asked me to participate to a big conference in Rome concerning pioneering family therapy. And so it was the first time I started really to use this concept of resilience, of thinking that the fact that my mother became an important, famous psychotherapy was connected with her own history of being a very abandoned, solitary child, completely out from...
Around the time of the war, wasn't she her arrival?
Concerning her family of origin, she was really an outcast, completely different, but in the first part, in the long first part of her life, but in the basic idea that in the second part of her life, she managed to become therapeutic in the moment of her mother's life and in the moment of her father's depression. And then the idea also that the marriage with my father was also very therapeutic for her. So
in what way? In what way, Matteo?
In the way that she really, in the language of attachment theory, we we can say that she had an insecure attachment, and my father gave her a secure base to gain a secure attachment. This was a big existential change for her, and so the idea that I think is basically her personal experience of important relational change in her family of origin and in her family of procreation as a therapeutic factor was the idea of family therapy.
Right.
But,
So I wonder then, so a part of her own family of origin story,
Yes.
and her experiences of trauma and loss and
Yes.
abuse and all that, and the forgotten self, like you're saying, the impetus, what was it called, a typical case of resilience that you wrote, that which is very heartwarming, heartbreaking and heartwarming at the same time. So her own story led her in the path where she's being professionally. But also what I'm hearing and I'm thinking, that your father also led it because he was able to provide that secure attachment within which she could communicate, and she opened up. And in opening up, she was able to do more of that exploratory work
Yes,
with
yes.
young people. So she was feeling perhaps more robust in order to do that. And so is that how it happened? Do you think?
Yes,
Yes.
it happened that maybe she was a really very happy marriage, because she was very vital and compensated some sad and depressive part of my father. So the integration of the couple was really very lucky, very good. This is interesting because this is really the idea of also a family of couple therapy.
Yes.
But really something. The problem is the old. If you read also the historical writing of Freud, you also have a vision of the family of something of doing harm, of pathological causing suffering, which is true many times, of course. But the strong idea of family therapy was to give light to the idea that family can also be cured, no?
That's right, absolutely.
And this is what my mother really lived in her own life, no?
Yes, that's wonderful, isn't it? And so you were able to collaborate quite a bit, and I guess she was able to expand and grow with that within herself, and also in the field and her approach and how she went.
Yes, with this positive idea. Also, if she had very bad experiences in her own family, but she managed, and this is what maybe sort of an example for the patient not to stay in the position of victim, how to transform them. This is the base of psychotherapy, Again,
absolutely.
this is what my mother experimented in her own life. So
That's
to
wonderful.
transform this victim position.
Yes, absolutely. There's a survivor and the resilience that comes from
in this way.
Exactly. And so I guess that explains her evolution, going from one kind of with how it started, the original 4, and then going in with Prata, and then later on doing a lot of work with you and Cirillo and Sorrentini. And that you would have been delighted to have that, your mother, been working with your mother. What are your thoughts? What was your experience like, Matteo?
Of course, it was also a difficult experience, but basically the other, before we said many change, my mother made a lot of changes, but the continuity, important continuity with this idea of working in teams, And this is what we are still faithful to this idea, With Stefano Cirillo and Anna Maria, 40 years we are working in teams, and this is a scientific battle we are doing, because in the systemic world this idea had not a so great success. The great part, for example, the majority, I think, of the great therapists like Moniel Cain, for example, always worked alone. And so this, I think, is actually an interesting battle, and maybe also journal as yours can have an discussion about that, because we really believe that we have to adapt the idea of working in teams, because maybe the paradox and paradox idea of 4 therapists for one session is obvious, is not possible,
It's not possible, it's not
but
realistic.
how to maintain the idea of team, especially for difficult cases,
Yes.
of course, I think it's a very actual idea, and we try to develop, especially for traumatic and very difficult patients, the idea of double taking in charge, the idea that you have a family therapist and an individual therapist working together. And this is, I believe, can be the future of psychotherapy of difficult patients.
And I guess this is part of the curiosity and the creativity and all the part of circularity and all that, but that diversity of blending in, because in a lot of the works that I've read about your mother and from you as well, Matteo, and it's the notion of certainly that application of circularity, of curiosity and creativity. And I guess particularly when working with young people, young anorectic people, and that would be such a fundamental thing. Those elements are key, and they connect with the notion of innovation, and it needs to be fluid in a way, isn't it? Because that's part of games, like you were talking about games, and bring that sense of playfulness into it. Because otherwise, it's very hard to work with young people, isn't it? Without that, to make it, a kind of like a novel idea. So the notion of rigidity doesn't quite work, isn't it? So that kind of, there is another integration right there, isn't it? So the historical context, what we had and what you set up, and then also the issues of today. So what's happening contemporary in our world now? We are living in a post-pandemic world, not quite even post-pandemic, but we're still in the middle of it.
In the middle, yes.
And with many variations throughout the world. But now that we've been touched by that deeply, and there would have to be a lot of adjustments that we have done. I mean, this is one of my first times I'm going off, and after so long coming to Italy, and I've been so privileged to come here and have a chat with you. But you see, there's all these differences that we need to come and reinvent ourselves almost, isn't it? So that creativity is key, and there is fluidity in that as well.
Of course, yes. Yes, my personal experience has been that to develop creativity as part of a group, of a very strong group, in the idea of the paritarian group. And this is the idea, our idea of creativity. But this was historically true, because also in the 70s with Bosco Cecchin was a very paritarian, a very creative group. And so this is the idea we want to defend in the field of systemic therapy. Because the risk of individualism is very strong also in the systemic, because there are, of course, very strong economical reasons. It's much easier to have an independent professional career, to maintain, to finance teamwork is very difficult. The problem is how to avoid that this economic limit becomes also a limit in creativity of working in teams. This is our
absolutely
scientific battle we are fighting.
And you have been found that different as well, some differences from COVID to the way you were running your classes, for example. That would have been a lot of changes that you'd have come up with. What would be those changes, do you think? Some things that you would have had to adapt.
Yes.
Because I know, I see, as I said, I'm doing an interview with you face to face. I couldn't do that before, for a while. So what would have been the things that would be different? Which leads me to another question, another curiosity of mine as well.
Yes.
From what would have a session with a family, with an individual, have looked like in the early days, in the 80s, as opposed to now? What would that, so perhaps if we can start there from what it would have looked like in the 80s and now in the middle of the pandemic and today.
No, there is something very different. For example, when my mother started develop her way to family therapy in the 70s, the 80s, the idea was to have only family sessions. Now we are thinking the topic I am treating more. I developed also in the last congresses, like in Bogota, is how to. When is very important to have during a family therapy individual session of the patient or other members of the family. So in the time of my mother, practically the division, I lived this division of many family therapists, like for example Luigi Boscolo, which maybe part of the week he worked in team with my mother, Prata, check-in, doing family therapy. And many afternoons he worked completely alone in individual therapy. So in the past, also not only from a theoretical point of view, but also from a practical point of view, we had a very strong division, really two different. Probably when he worked individually, he worked much like a psychoanalyst. But when he tried also to develop an original way of doing individual therapy in a systemic way, but this is, I think, this is a process of this year, starting from a strong division from the two different settings, and now I feel there are still strong resistance in the systemic field, tendency of doing only family session, and our investigation at the contrary is now in this idea. How really can we? This is also connected with the theme of with the topic of team, because to have a solitary therapist who conduct individual and family session, I think is a big technical mistake, because emotionally too much for an isolated therapist to do all kind of setting with complicated family. So with complicated family and patient, we need a team, but we need also this flexibility or creativity of thinking when you have to use the family setting, and when you don't need anymore the family, and it's better to have different individual set. I think.
So you're having more considerations about those.
This
days.
field of investigation of the flexible use of different settings in the same process of treatment. This, I think, it's a very actual and interesting topic.
Right. And so the classes that you run, the school that you run with the students, how is it different to before? In the early days, what would be the differences? What are the similarities and what are the differences?
The big difference is also maybe the main difference is that when I was a student in systemic therapy, I was in Boscolo Check-in school at the end of the 70s. There was no personal. Boscolo Check-in didn't work like on the personal side of the therapy, as you said before. Now, I think in our working with trainees now, this personal side is so. I think we had also, thanks to the works of people like Maurizio Andolfi, big development on this idea of working in groups on the personal part of the therapist. The work through genography, through sculpture, through many. Really, we developed many important techniques on working on this personal side of the therapy. So, from my time, many years ago, this is at the time was a very, this is, I think, però is a risk of systemic thinking. I feel is still actual, something a little too psychopedagogical, no? As in reality, if I think of our work in the 80s, we had in a way this risk of the idea of invariant prescription, no? Is the idea of the sort of psychopedagogic idea, the idea of the therapy like something invariant. Is an idea that now I cannot accept. Really, now I think that any psychotherapy must have a very specific part, unique for this patient. And in reality, when I like in Bogota, when I am in some systemic conferences, I feel this risk of too psychopedagogic, too invariant way of doing therapy. And this I don't like. So this is another scientific struggle.
Okay.
How to fight against this risk.
So I hear that lately the changes are with your students, the training. You tend to bring a little bit more of the personal work as
Yes.
well, and it's so evident. I mean, as I said, we've been touched, all of us equally,
Yeah,
therapists
I
or
think
non-therapists with by COVID, for example, major part, just like with war and then now with COVID and the pandemic, it's touched us all in different ways. So it's and I collaborated with a few family therapists around the world with the
Yes.
beginning of the pandemic, and just about their personal and professional insights, because I felt that was so important to connect with the self, because we were losing family members. We were also disconnected from them because of closed
Yes.
borders and all those kinds. We haven't seen them for years,
Yes.
or all those kind of things. So there needs to be that sense, and I guess part of the work of your mother, and like you said so yourself, was that they've been touched by a lot of her history, her personal history, her family history came into realm, or gave her the impetus, as we said, to actually do the work that she did. And her relationships, her family, and also forming that secure attachment with your father, her
Yes.
husband, also gave her another to continue on, and gave her that energy and that enthusiasm to connect with that again. So it's just all this part of self. So we cannot detach from that aspect, can we? I know you've written quite a bit, and also you've written about, you've also gathered some of your mother's works,
Yes.
publications and books. And so do you want to share something about any of those? Like, is there particular something, I don't know, whether it's a particular quote or a particular segment of it, or something, paragraph that you want to share, a particular idea that you want to share about any of those works that can sit with you, that is accessible to you right now?
The basic idea I have already discussed is the idea of working in team. This was really an idea. No, and also what I can stress now is also this idea of understanding really the causes of suffering. No? This is an idea which is not accepted by everybody. No? A lot of people, also in the systemic field, are very polemic. They say we don't need to understand. We are only to try. And this was an idea also from the human point of view of the therapist, the idea of the therapist which is only an agent of change, but the only idea, the same idea that you can work with people without trying really to understand why they are suffering. I find this idea very bad. So I think from this point of view, the message of my my mother gave me, I was burning of curiosity, curiosity to understand, not only curiosity, yes, of course, we want also to be useful, but the passion to understand, I think is something my mother left me.
Right. And how did it lead to, so was it, I guess, the path of your mother that led you into the curiosity of getting into the field, or
Yes.
closer to mother anyway, so doing, psychology. So is that how it came about? How did it come about? Did you kind of know that you were going to become a psychologist at one point?
Now
as
I
well?
am
Yeah.
also a 36 years old, which is a psychotherapist too. So we have a
Yes.
three generational.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Absolutely.
It's a three generational process now.
Yes.
Now we have already the third generation.
Right.
Yes.
Oh well, that's wonderful. What does your son practice? What-
Yes. She's practicing
daughter, yes.
here
Yes.
in Milan as a
Yes.
So this process goes on also for three generations. Also
That's
from the point of
fantastic.
view of my
Yes.
family.
And so does your child also collaborate with you? Do you work together?
No,
Not
we
really.
are
Yeah.
nothing deep. We have a collaboration.
Yes.
I send in some patients.
Yeah.
We discussed
Yeah.
sometimes his cases.
Yeah.
But anyways, this was also a good experience for me. The possibility of involving also one of my children
That's wonderful.
in the profession like my mother made with me.
That's beautiful. That's so pretty special. So I'm wondering, we're coming towards the end. I wish I could have a conversation with you for a lot longer, but I know I'm also very mindful about the fact that you've got a sore leg, and you've been very kind sitting there without even putting your leg up. So I'm really,
It was not
and
so
you're welcome.
polite.
Yes. So I hope all the best for your leg. But yes, so I'm mindful of not letting you stay, without putting your leg up, really, without resting. So I want to know, I guess, out of the other things I wanted to get a bit of a picture about, one of the things I like to know, I guess, what maybe a message or something that you want to send to people. One, perhaps something that you would like to share with them, because I'm hoping that this will be, an article we'll write about this. And so a message that you want to tell others about something that maybe they might not be aware about you or your mother, as an influence, about your work. And the other is also, what message would you like to give to, I feel that the practitioners that are the current practitioners, those that are fresh and those ones that are seasoned, but as well as the students. I'm a very, I've got the teacher in me, which is very much always sits in there. I'm academic as well, so very much what's the message you want to give to the emerging
A
psychotherapists?
message I have lived in my life, and also the story of our school is the topic of follow-ups. So the practice of contacting our patients also many years after.
Yes.
This was really very, very important. Many of the, because if you work only knowing something about your patient in the moment you stop therapy, I think you have an important deformation. If you learn what happened 1 year ago, 10 years ago, yes, this is a message. We have lived that because we have built some books and papers studying, interviewing with the patient of the paradoxical time, of the patient of the invariant prescription. We made a very big work about follow-ups, but I think this is an important idea for psychotherapy in general, because it's true that doing real quantitative research is something impossible so far in psychotherapy, but the ethical also attitude of the therapist, of staying in contact with your patient, I think this is something where you can learn a lot.
Yes, that's very valuable because you want to. You've spent time, particularly if you started as as an analyst, psychoanalyst. You know, you started and you have a long-term experience with a particular patient, client, and then suddenly that's it, goodbye. And it'd be quite interesting to be able to have that trajectory of to see
And
how it is.
Many psychotherapists
Yes,
don't
I
do
know,
that. Systemic psycho. I
Yes.
think to have an idea what the patient think of therapy after 5 years, after
Precisely.
10 years,
Yes.
I think this is something the field has to
Yes,
cultivate.
I agree, and
Yeah.
that's something maybe you can write about too, Matteo. And the other thing, so that would be the message, and the other, that you share as well about yourself and about your son and all that, the three-generational story. And there was something you wanted to share too about a project that you are coming up with, isn't it? You were sharing something with me just before we're having a chat.
I am going to
Yes.
publish a book which is going out in October. My last project is really to integrate post-traumatic ideas. Really, the name of the book is The 6 Phases of the Resiliency. I have already written a paper on this, but this paper of 10 years ago, I built a group of nearly 40 therapists, all with my same training. We really, in the last 12 years, we really confronted our experience with post-traumatic patients, and so we arrived to a book which we have called a systemic model for traumatic treatments, and this is an interesting project.
Yes.
I like very much. This is the same idea we have discussed today. The idea of integrating family therapy in the traumatic field, which is a very individualistic field, but integrating also a mediaire, all the individual approach to trauma. I have this general idea that we use with anorexia, with everything. The last project was to integrate, to have a group of investigation who reached the aim of having a book illustrating
That
with
sounds
many
amazing.
clinical examples.
Yes.
This idea, it's also the idea of thinking,
Yes.
maybe also the idea not so normal in family therapy, in systemic therapy, is the idea of evaluating during psychotherapy the phase where the patient is in this precise moment, and to adapt your therapy to the phase. And this is the idea of the 6 phases of resilience.
That's so
The idea of this is not so obvious consideration of
How did you come about? How did you come about?
This is a matter also of integrating ideas from not systemic therapies. For example, in this case, I enjoyed a lot when I read many years ago Judith Herman concept of putting the patient insecurity like as the second phase. I don't know, maybe in her model it's the first phase of traumatic treatment. No? And this was me was very important. This Herman idea about put in safety maybe the patient, because the provocative family therapy we had during many years didn't consider this idea. No, we in the past, in the 70s, in the 80s, we were invariant psychopedagogically in this sense, as I said before, in doing something provocative with every family we saw. And this idea of evaluating the phase in which the patient or the family is the book is really, the new book is really, we expanding the idea, the Herman idea of 3 phases in 6 phases.
That's interesting.
So it was the basic idea is anyway this, which was not something I lived in the first part of my career. I found and discover very important, and so now we are using a lot of this idea of thinking in which phase of his evolution
Wow.
is a patient is important to consider.
That's so interesting, and that's so congruent with what you just said before about what happens in transitioning a patient, a client, from finishing therapy and post. What
Exactly.
happens? So very much that notion. There's that congruency.
Yes, you can see precisely
Yes.
that. Maybe
Yes.
some intervention you had were correct, but not in the right time, so not
Yes.
useful really.
Wonderful. Well, I very much look forward to reading it and collaborating with it too. That's very exciting.
Thank you, Daisy.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, really a big privilege to be able to have a conversation with you today, Matteo. And thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for welcoming me into your home as well. And even the home where you were born. This is just a plus.
same,
What
yes.
a privilege. It's amazing.
No,
Amazing.
I'm very happy because, as I said before, I feel sad about this scientific and professional distance with, for example, the Australian world.
Yes.
We not have any contact. So
And
I was
this is
very happy
important.
of the possibility
Yes.
you gave me of establishing a small bridge,
Beautiful.
a contact.
Sounds wonderful. And we'll be doing more of that. Matteo,
you, thank you.
grazie mille del mio
Gra-
cuore.